Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Thank you very much for making it out on this incredibly ugly, rainy, post-Thanksgiving, pre-Christmas, sandwiched in between two sermon series, not really sure what we're going to talk about kind of weekend. Thank you for making it. This would have been very uncomfortable had you not made it. It's been a very awkward exchange between me and the seats. Originally, this is the post-Thanksgiving weekend. It's the pre-Christmas weekend. We were trying to figure out, what it is that we should plug into this spot, and I struggled with that for a while. Actually, I think where we've landed is in a good spot. We've landed in a place where I think we're going to continue the theme that Rajendra had last week of greater things, and us doing greater things, but we're also hopefully going to set up for the next series that's coming, which is going to start with Christmas. Actually, if you don't know, Rajendra is going to be launching into a series next week that is going to carry us from Christmas, starting next week with Luke 1, and it's going to carry us all the way through to Easter, and we are going to stay camped out in the book of Luke, which is a very, very cool idea for a sermon series, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So make sure you guys prioritize that and being with us on Sunday mornings. So I'm excited for that series, and I'm excited that it's going to begin with Christmas, because Christmas really is the greatest rescue mission that ever happened, the greatest rescue mission that the world has ever seen. It's the mission of God stepping into his world to rescue it and save it from all that was broken and lost and destroyed by the fall. Christmas is a time where we get to reflect on our loving and compassionate God going the ultimate distance to repair what we broke. And that's actually what I want to focus on today. What did we break? What was God's original design intent? What did we lose in the fall? And how can we reclaim it here in 2019? So to do that, I want to journey back to Genesis 1, to the creation account, and I want to have another look. I want to give you guys a different set of lenses to look through. We're going to try and read that with fresh eyes, and that's kind of difficult because that's a very recognizable passage to a lot of us. Some of us have read it hundreds of times, right? So today we're going to start with that creation account. Then we're going to touch on the concept of temple and what temple meant to those early hearers. And then after we've got a fresh perspective, we're going to do a sweep through some New Testament passages that we've heard before and hopefully see those in a slightly different light. And then at the end, I'm going to give you two real-life so what application steps so that you can take. So, in this message, we're going to need to do a little groundwork. We're going to have to do most of that on the front half of this message. We're going to look at things a little differently. We're going to do some Bible study, and it might feel like tough sledding, but don't worry, we're going to get through it, and we're going to get to the application part. The first part of this message, we're going to set up the pins, and the second half of the message, we're going to knock them down. Is that cool? Everybody good? I like seeing thumbs. That's awesome. Okay, before we launch into this journey, though, I have two disclaimers. Keep hands and feet inside the vehicle style disclaimers for you all. First, we're going to be in Genesis 1, and I want you to know that I am well aware of all the debates that rage in mostly North American evangelical circles about Genesis 1. Good news, I'm not dealing with any of those things. I want to keep Rajendra's inbox clean and clear, and so we will not touch on any debates that you all might have in your spare time about Genesis 1. Today we are not going to be talking about science. We are going to be talking about text. We're going to be talking about the words of Scripture. I will state for the record that I believe God created everything out of nothingness and he spoke it into existence, in case you were wondering. You all can believe whatever you want about the age of the earth or evolution or any of those things, and you can be perfectly comfortable coming along this journey. I want to talk about what the text might have said to the original hearers, and if that sounds like it is assaulting your scientific point of view, trust me, it's not. Consider this, if you feel that way, consider this just another layer to a very multi-layered book that speaks to us in many different ways. Okay? Is everybody good with disclaimer number 1? Good. Okay, disclaimer number 2, I actually really like this, and I think we're going to see this phrase show up around here more often. Here it is. Here's disclaimer number 2. This was said by a guy named John Walton. We have to acknowledge that the Bible was written for us, but the Bible was not written to us. Do you understand the difference? The Bible was absolutely written for you and for I here in Mount Airy in 2019. It's for us. God meant it for us. On the other hand, we have to understand that the Bible was not written to us. The Bible was written to different groups of people, and those different groups of people lived in a different time. They lived in a different place. They had different cultural norms. They had different neighbors than we have. They had different values and different reference points. They lived a different way of life than we live. When God communicated and he revealed himself to the original hearers, he communicated in their language, not in English, oddly enough. He communicated to their perspective. He communicated to their culturally conditioned understanding of the way the world works, not to ours. And this is a principle that's true throughout history. When God speaks and reveals himself, he doesn't talk over anyone's head. No good communicator would do that, right? When God speaks, he speaks in a way that we will understand. If you will, God comes down to our level of understanding. He does not expect us to come up to his level of understanding. He talks in a way we'll hear him. Perfect example, when Jesus speaks in the parables, he uses first century Jewish life as a reference point. He talks about things like farming and fishing and banquets and Samaritans, things that we don't have much of an understanding of in our world today. If he were speaking to them, he would not use things like iPhones or stock markets or cars or even Cardi B's as reference points, right? If you're not laughing, you're not old enough, or you're not young enough. You're too old. Paul, you didn't laugh at either service. Don't lie. You got that? All right. We'll talk afterwards. No, God communicates in time and in place, and he uses the things around us to communicate to us. So what that means is that when we read the Bible, we need to do a little extra work, and we need to challenge our assumptions, and we have a lot of assumptions. We have to be very frank and transparent about the fact that we live in an age of science. We live in an age of technology. We live in an age of individualism and democracy. None of these things existed when the Bible was written. That means when the Bible talks about cities, it does not conceive of anything like New York or Washington, D.C. That would be totally foreign. When the Bible talks about kings and kingdoms, we might imagine a knight in shining armor. They wouldn't. They didn't have that chivalrous medieval knight. That's not what kings and kingdoms meant to them. When the Bible talks about marriage, the Bible does not conceive of this romantic idealism of, Harry met Sally or the Notebook. That's not the concept of marriage that they would have had. And when the Bible presents a creation narrative, it does not have this image in mind. In fact, if you showed that picture to any of the original hearers, they would have no idea what they were looking at, right? The world of the ancient Israelites was very different than our own, and they did not have a scientific or a material view of the world. They didn't know what the world was made of. They didn't even know that it was made of atoms, right? They didn't have a sense for microbiology. They didn't know about astronomy or gravity or germ theory. They didn't know that the world was round. They didn't know about any of it, and quite frankly, I don't think most of them would have cared. Those are modern concerns. Those are the things that we worry about. Those are the things that we think about when we read the text. Their concern was not about what the universe was made of or how it came into being from a scientific standpoint. They had two concerns when they read Genesis 1, those original hearers. Concern number one is which God is in charge. There were lots of different gods that were talked about, and all of their neighbors had different gods. They wanted to know which one is in charge. That would have been concern number one. And concern number two for them would have been, how does everything work? How is everything supposed to function? And what's our role in that? What's my role in that? When they first heard Genesis 1, not a single hearer would have thought about the age of the earth. So if we want to hear what they heard, we need to set that aside for a minute. Okay, so we're gonna do our Bible study. We're gonna jump in. We're gonna read the first few verses of this creation account, and then we're gonna start, putting some meat on the bone and doing some so what. Let's take a deep breath though, and let's pray. I always like to pray before we read Scripture, and especially when we read something that we've read so many times before. If you've read it 100 times or more, you need a special prayer because God is going to try and show you something new today. So let's pray for open eyes. Dear Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that your word was written for us in Mount Airy. Thank you that we can understand more of who you are by the words of Scripture. Lord, I pray a special prayer for us that we can read these ancient words with fresh and ancient eyes. Lord, help us to see what you are communicating. Help us to set our assumptions aside for the next 20 minutes or so and to just see what it would have sounded like to an ancient Israelite to read these words. Amen. Okay, here we go. Genesis 1. Regenda likes to say, turn to page 1842 or whatever. I don't know what page this is, but I'm guessing it's 1. So if you have a Bible, turn to 1. That's where we're going to start. That's an easy one for those of us that have not flipped around the Bible so much. Or you have an insert, and I think these words are on the insert. You can follow along, and it's also perfectly acceptable to follow along on your phone. Okay, here we go. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Okay, so what's going on here when we look through ancient eyes? What happens when we're not concerned with a how-to style creation narrative and we stop thinking about God creating atoms and material out of nothing? What we see when we look at this text is that God calls the light day. Now that's interesting. The first thing us modern scientific folks will realize is that light and day are not the same thing. Light is an electromagnetic field of some sort. I don't know what light is. It's a wavelength. Someone smarter than me can tell you what light is, but it is certainly not day. That must not be what the story is about. Remember, this story is about how the world functions, not what it's made of. Light's function and light's purpose in the eyes of the early hearers is that it provides us the basis of time. Similarly, darkness is not night. We understand that. Darkness is not night. That must not be what the story is about. Darkness is the absence of light. So what the story is telling us is that God is bringing order and functionality into his creation through time. That's what is set up here on the first day. The point for them is not the creation of the sun, because they didn't know what the sun was from a material standpoint, and they wouldn't have cared that it was an enormous ball of burning gas millions of miles away. What they cared about is, how does it work here in God's world? Let's back up and look at verse 2. This is a fun one. It says that the earth was formless and void. Actually, one of the coolest Hebrew phrases out there, formless and void, is tohu vavohu, which is very fun to say. You should practice it when you go home. Formless and void is the way that the earth is described. And I honestly, close your eyes right now. I've read this passage 100 times, so do this because I always have an image pop into my mind. When you read that the earth is formless and void, what do you picture in your mind's eye? Do you imagine something like a dark ball of nothingness, some ball of liquid Play-Doh that God is ready to roll up his sleeves and start sculpting? That's kind of what I imagine. You guys can open your eyes. I imagine like a Jupiter-style ball, right? I'm worried about the material and the physical. What did it look like? I don't think that's the right picture. In fact, I think that's exactly the wrong picture. I think the first hearers, when they heard formless and void and the Spirit of God hovering over the waters and over the deep, they would have heard that the world is a chaotic place. It's a place that's lacking order without God. The deep and the sea always represented disorder to them, not a lack of material substance in a physical space. Okay, let's move on to day 2. Day 2 brings us a little more functionality. See if you can see the functionality happening here. It says, "Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters.' And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day." So for the ancient people, they believed that there was a big reservoir of water up there. And actually, on a day like today, you can see why they thought that, right? They didn't have a concept of meteorology or anything like that. What they imagined is there's a lot of water up there, and there's obviously water down here, and so God creates something that separates that water from this water, and it holds that water up there most of the time. Sometimes it comes down from there. That's what they would have understood. So, what is that telling us? It's not telling us much about the material known as the expanse. It's telling us about purpose. And what is the purpose of the expanse? Well, for them, it would have been weather. In the first day, God brought order through time. In the second day, God creates the purpose and the functionality of weather patterns, especially the all-important rain. And rain was a really big, important deal for ancient people. It affected their daily lives, it affected their health, and it affected their economy, the way that they survived, right? Okay, so that's day 2. Let's move on to day 3. Day 3, verses 9 and 10 deal with the creation of dry ground. God seems to be doing that Play-Doh thing where he's forming dry ground. He's separating and all of that. And our material friends might say, aha, now God's rolling up his sleeves and really getting to work. But look at verses 11 through 13. This is the punchline of day 3. Remember, God is concerned, or they're concerned with the functionality. What does it function as? All right, here we go. 11 to 13, it says, "Then God said, 'Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit-bearing trees bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them on the earth.' And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit after their kind. And God saw that that was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day." Okay, we're thinking functionality. Does anyone see the functionality in day 3 in these verses? The function, what God is creating, is food. He's creating seed-bearing, fruit-bearing, food-producing vegetation. On day 3, God created the vegetation to function. The vegetation had a purpose, and its function was providing food. So in the first 3 days of creation, we see God bringing the most basic, functional human elements into his created order. We see time, weather, and food. So tell me, how many of your conversations revolve around either time, weather, or food? It's what we talk about. It's what's most critical to our existence, most basic to our existence. Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 1 is that Genesis is trying to tell us not so much about how God created elements as much as it's trying to tell us the functional purpose of the elements. That's my first point. It's been a long one, so I'll leave you with the rest of the passage to digest and read for yourself at home. If I were Rajendra, I would at this moment ask you for a favor, and you would all agree to give me 15 minutes of your time. I'm not going to do that because I trust you're so interested. You don't need me to ask you for a favor. You're going to go read yourself at home. Okay, I'm not going to read the days 4 and 5. You can do that at home. Here's a clue, though. Day 4 is about the rhythm of seasons and the ability to navigate. God creates the sun, moon, and stars to govern the day and govern the night. Now, the sun, moon, and stars is how they would have gotten around and how they would have known how to plant their crops and where, the appropriate time for certain things. God gives them that functional purpose. Day 5 and 6 don't necessarily describe functions, but they describe the functionaries or the people, the animals that are going to inhabit the earth that God has created. But day 6 culminates in the creation of mankind. And mankind is given a functional purpose. Mankind is given a reason for being. And that's where we're going to zoom in and we're going to find point number 2. Okay, let's look at it. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. And by the 7th day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done." So did everybody catch the purpose? What are humans for? If you're ancient and you're reading this, and your second concern is, what am I supposed to do? What am I here for? What was it? We're going to swerve a little bit, because I know what you think you're about to say, but let's swerve. If you were a person in the ancient world and you just got to those verses reading the Genesis story, you would say, aha, I know what this story is about. This story is about a temple. And none of you have any idea why they would have thought that, probably, right? I know it sounds a little bit odd, but hear me out. If we had those ancient eyes to see, we would recognize that when God spoke this creation narrative, he did so to people who had heard other creation stories. In fact, most cultures and all of their neighbors had creation stories of their own. For those people, creation stories generally went hand in hand with temple stories. Most ancient people had temples in their land where their gods resided, and most of the times those stories went together. Those stories about creation and temple, they followed a certain form and they had certain features. We have ways of telling stories today that are recognizable. I'll prove it to you. So if I said, I'm going to tell you a story. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, what kind of story am I telling? Fairy tale, right? We know the pattern. We recognize the pattern. There are certain distinguishing, identifiable features. Now, if I launched into my fairy tale story, you would expect there to be a hero, a villain, a damsel in distress, and a happy ending, probably, right? We recognize the form that certain types of stories take. Now, for the ancient people, they had parallel creation and temple stories, of which Genesis 1 is written in a similar style, albeit with major differences to their neighbors. So here are the two major tip-offs that would have told those ancient people, we're talking about temple here. Major tip-off number 1 is that when he's done, God comes into the space. He comes to rest and to dwell in the space. They would have said, I see what's happening. God built a space for himself. Right? That's what most of the gods in other temple stories did. Number 2 distinguishing feature is that God's image is placed within the space that he created. Temples had the image of the God put inside them. Okay, one of the most famous of these parallel stories at the time was from the Babylonians. They were next door neighbors. The Israelites had a little bit of a checkered past with them, but they actually had a creation and a temple story about their God. Their God was Marduk. This is what that handsome guy looks like. He's got wings and one of those really cool beards with I'm not sure what's in them, and that looks like a cone maybe. I'm not sure what it is. That's Marduk. He was the god of the Babylonians. Now, if you read the Babylonian creation and temple story, you'll see that Marduk was a tough guy. He had to gain control and defeat the other gods. And then at the end of his story, or nearing the end of his story, he builds a temple where he's going to take his rest and his rule there. And that's what that temple looked like. That was in Babylon. And actually, some scholars think that is where the idea of the Tower of Babel came from. Actually, more specifically, the story tells us not that he built that temple for himself. It says that he made bricks, and then he conscripted humans to act as his slaves to build that temple for himself. And then Marduk went in there, and then all of the people, when they saw that temple, they know, well, that's where our God is. And if we want to go talk to our God, that's where he is. And then when they went in, they knew that's what he looked like. See, the images and the sculptures of ancient gods were treated with high reverence and high respect. They would bow down to it. The ancient people believed the presence of their God was in the temple, and it resided in the form of that image or that sculpture that was within the temple. And they took great care to bring food and drink and offerings to lay in front of that sculpture, and they held that in very, very high and sacred esteem. Okay, so now let's go back to Genesis. When we read the Genesis creation passage with these ancient eyes, right? When we look through these lenses against their cultural backdrop, it creates a total paradigm shift for me. What is the text actually telling us? Do you see what it's saying about the cultural backdrop and the cultural understanding? Day 6 and day 7, it says that God's creation was a place that he designed for his presence to fill. God created a place where he could come in and he could live and he could take his rest there. As a quick sidebar, I've read Rest for years now, and I thought God needed a nap because creating material things was such hard work. I actually don't think that's what rest is in this context. Rest in this context is more like when you move into a new house, you unpack all of your boxes, and then you rest from your unpacking. But that doesn't mean you're done. That means you actually start to live in the house. You start to inhabit the house that you just set up for yourself. That's what this story is telling us. It's saying that God made this earth, all of it, not just a small space. God made the whole earth to live in, to dwell in. This is where God was meant to be. Every square inch of this earth was designed for God's presence to be felt and seen, and his rule to extend everywhere from Mount Airy to Mozambique to Mumbai to Maui, right? God intended for his presence to be everywhere, to fill the entire earth. The whole earth was his temple, not like that guy who's got about, 1,000 square feet. God wanted every square inch of creation for himself. The whole place was his temple. That's what the text is telling us. But the text is also telling us something very interesting about ourselves. It says that we were designed to be like that, but for God. We were designed to be the image of God in his new creation. I really don't have words big enough to explain this to you all. God created this world as his temple, the place where his presence could be, and then he created us as his image, so that when the rest of creation looked around to see who was this God that was running the show, they would see you and me. We are his image. That's what image is meant in the cultural context. We are that for the living God. When problems arose or things seem out of whack in the world, most ancient people would head to that temple and they would petition their God. God planned that when things seemed out of whack or when creation needed repair, they would see us. we would be the ones to act on God's behalf. We would be his answer. I don't know if I'm explaining this well or not, but let me keep plowing and see if I can connect the dots. In Exodus chapter 20, the law is being given through Moses. And one of the very important things in the Ten Commandments is you shall not make an image in the form of anything in heaven above or the earth beneath or the waters below. Why should we not make an image? Why should we not have something that we create to represent God? God's already done that. He already made an image. He placed his image in his temple, and we are to see one another as the sacred image bearers of the God that created us. The ancient people revered their images and their statues, and we were meant to have that level of reverence and respect for one another because we all carry the image of the God that created. Genesis is not about God making something from nothing, not just about that at least. It is about him making us from nothing for something. God made us for something. He created us for a functional purpose. In the Genesis account, the early hearers would have instantly thought in terms of function, not material, and they would have thought we were created to represent God to the rest of creation. Representing him to the rest of creation means living in the way and operating in the way that he would, or the way that he would want us to. It means acting in ways that are perfectly selfless, like God is. It means us acting with perfect compassion in the way that God is compassionate towards us. It means being in perfect community because God is perfect community. It means for us to be his representatives, we're to be honest and peaceful and patient and wise and perfectly loving. When all things that inhabit this world saw us, they would know what God's character was like. And when I meditate on that, when I think about what it would be like to be in an unbroken community by sin, I long for that. I just long for that kind of community where we see one another in the way that God sees us. That kind of perfect community is what the intro song was about. That song was called Total Freedom. I love the lyrics to that song. My dear friend Alan Crow, who's one of our trustees, he actually texted me that song, oddly enough, as I was preparing for this message, and it was one of those inspired moments. It took all of 60 seconds for me to forward it to Andy and say, hey, can you play this for us? That song is called Total Freedom. It says we didn't care at all about who had more or who came from less or who was rich or who was poor. We didn't care at all about who got first or who got here last or who was best or worst. We had total freedom. It sounds like God's original design intent. We had total freedom. That is quite a vision of humanity. That's a vision of peace. That is what God's shalom is really all about. Sadly, though, that vision was lost in the fall. That vision was lost due to sin. Romans tells us we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory that God originally intended. We did this when we traded our image for his, right? He gave us his image and we said, no thanks. We'll take our own image. And that was a bad trade because when we traded for those things, we traded for death when we were designed for life. God is eternal and we traded one for the other. We took death instead of life. We traded for selfishness and holding on to our own things when God created us to be completely selfless to the rest of creation. We traded shame and secrets and hiding when we were designed to be free and unashamed. We traded for sadness when we were designed for joy. We traded for sickness when we were designed for perfect health. We traded for evil when we were designed for good and for hate when we were designed for love. It was a bad trade because we were designed for so much more. And I would submit to you, we have not thought highly enough of ourselves as humans, right? We always say, well, I'm human. I think we have a very low opinion of ourselves, and God created us with a much higher calling. We've not thought of ourselves as highly as God has thought of us. The psalmist says it this way. There's a tension in this verse, right? There's this human tension. It says, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? What is human beings that you care for them? The psalmist is wrestling with this. But then the psalmist answers the question, what are we? Well, you have made man a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands, and you put everything under their feet. That's what God designed us for. The fall has ultimately caused us to lose our identity, to lose our image, and to lose our vocation. Most of us do not go through life thinking about how can I act on God's behalf. Most of us unconsciously place ourselves at the center and only consider how can we preserve our own image? How can we preserve ourselves in this difficult situation? And that's where I want to pivot to Christmas. That's where I think we're going to provide a little backdrop for the weeks ahead. This is why Jesus burst onto the scene. This is why God crossed the cosmic divide and launched the greatest rescue mission of all time. See, Jesus came not to start something new, but to repair what was broken and to restore us to our original identity and our original vocation. We're going to launch into Advent season next week, but I really want to do that against the backdrop of the idea that Jesus is the second Adam. Jesus is God's putting it right again, to do it right again. Jesus is the one who is fully man, and he shows us what our vocation and our job description looks like when it's lived out perfectly here on the earth. Jesus came to restore us to the image bearers that we were created to be. Jesus came to us knowing that living on our own behalf is a small and foolish vision for our lives. He came to show us what it looks like to be the image of the invisible God in a world that is often chaotic and disorderly. Jesus shows us what it looks like to be God's representative, to be God's man, to be God's woman when we're walking on the road to Samaria or walking on the road to Silver Spring. Jesus did come to save us, and he did come to make a way for us back to God, but he also told us, you are not simple spectators in this arrangement. We're made in God's image, and he wants to trade back what we had traded. He wants to trade back his image for our own. He wants us to worry about managing his image instead of doing our own image management. He wants to trade us back the life that we traded for death. He wants to trade his self for our selfishness. God wants to trade and give us freedom for the shame and the secrets and the hiding that we often do. He wants to give us joy for sadness and health for illness and good for evil. And he wants to give us back love instead of hate and all the rest that goes along with that. So, in the short time that I have remaining, let's look at a few New Testament verses and maybe thinking in the context of the Old Testament, still with those ancient lenses on, maybe these New Testament verses will say something slightly different to us than we've seen before. Let's start with Matthew 14. It says, God is the light of the world. No. What Matthew 5:14 says is very counterintuitive for a lot of us. We read it and we don't really grasp it. God says, you are the light of the world. The one that spoke and made light says, you are the light of the world. God made you as his image bearers. You are the ones that carry the light into the world. The same is true for salt. You are the salt of the earth. God is not the salt of the earth. You are. We're made in his image. We represent him. If we want him to be out in the world, we are the ones to take him, right? 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple? You are God's temple, and God's Spirit lives in you. Well, what is a temple? What would that have meant? The temple, in an ancient and technical sense, is where God lives in the world. It's the space that he occupies. For Marduk, that was that tiny little box. But God says, you are my space that I occupy in this world. Where is God today? Look no further than this room. You are his temple. Ephesians 4:22 and 24 says, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, put away your image," okay, which is being corrupted by deceitful desires, and to make new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on a new self, which is created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. You were created for so much more. You ought to think higher of yourself. In Ephesians 4, we read that we together are called the body of Christ. Where is Christ on this earth? He's right here. He's with his people. We are his image. When people look to us and look to our community, they should see Christ. Galatians 2:20 says it this way. It says, "I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." 1 Corinthians 12:27 says it like this. It says, "All of you together are Christ's body, and each of you is a part of it." You were designed to be God's image, and that image was marred and broken, but when Jesus comes back, or when Jesus came back, he began to restore us to that original intent. Those of us that follow Jesus, we get the matchless gift of salvation, but we also begin to live the life that God originally designed us to live. Jesus steps into our lives, and he shows us what it looks like to bear the image of the God that made us. Jesus steps in when we accept him, and he begins the process, one step at a time, of restoring us to the very good creation that we were intended to be. And as he restores us, he activates us. He activates us to be his agents, to be his wise stewards to a creation that is broken and in desperate need of healing. When will God step in and fix this mess? I mean, we often think that, right? When's he going to fix all these messes that we see around us? I'll tell you exactly when God's going to do it. He's going to do it when he can restore us to his image, and when he can restore others to his image and cast the vision for what he intended this world to look like. A place for him to come in and dwell and be amongst us. He saves us to serve. He restores us so we can repair. He makes us healthy so we can heal. And he loves us so we can love others. All right, so let's do this. I'm at the end. I told you I have two punchlines, two real-life applications for you all. The first that I want to give you is about how to help people become restored to the image bearers that God really intended for them to be. The second is for those of you that do bear God's image, that have taken that role and have taken that vocation on yourselves. Okay, so the first punchline is the Alpha course. We're going to be launching the Alpha course, which is a course that's designed for those that are not believers. We are going to invite folks in, and we're going to have conversation with them. Alpha, you can read up on it. Really, really good program. Very accessible for anybody that is far away from God, but would at least be open to having the conversation. In fact, when we announced Alpha, I had come up here and I had told you all that you're going to have people in your lives, and some of them are ready for that invite, and some of them just start working, but you're a long way off probably, right? And I told you I have a friend who is an atheist. He's 10 years or one tragedy away from being open to hearing about an invitation to Alpha. But I started praying for him because, I think maybe in 10 years God might want something, or the way might be open for me to make that ask. And wouldn't you know it, him and his wife came over for dinner a couple weeks ago, and for some reason, I saw that there was soft ground. And so I took my opportunity, I acted on God's behalf, and I said, hey, why don't you check out Alpha? And you know it, he said yes. I mean, what a wild thing. I never would have thought. So we're going to show this video, and what I want you guys to be thinking about as this video plays is God went the ultimate distance for me. Who does he want me to go the distance for? Who does he want me to reach out to invite to Alpha? And if you do, just write their name down, and anyway, watch this video.
We all have that person in our lives. That neighbor we pass by every day outside our homes. That coworker we see at the office 5 days a week. Or those friends we catch up with every once in a while. People we wish could know and experience the love of God. How do we share it? Where do we even start? Deep inside, we know that it'll cost us something to open up our lives and share our faith. It takes time, vulnerability, sacrifice, the risk of rejection. But this is our call, to open our lives and to share Christ with the people close to us. Because it's only through opening your life up that spaces for honest conversations are possible. Spaces where people can truly be themselves and explore the deepest parts of life with people they know and trust. That's why we're running Alpha. It's a course over several weeks where you can invite your friends to explore life's biggest questions over a meal. It's a chance for you to invite that person into an honest conversation about faith. Because when it's hard to find the moment, or the words, or the courage, you can simply invite. Alpha, who will you invite?
All right, so my hope is that as you guys were watching that, God put a name of someone in your heart, in your mind, and I hope he bugs you just so bad until you invite that person. I really hope God does, in a holy way, of course, but I hope that just gnaws at you. If you want any more information, you can check out the website. You can come talk to me, but we would love if you would invite someone to Alpha. Okay, next, I want to show a video and throw out a request to those of you who have already been activated to be God's agents in this world. Here's the backstory. A week ago on Monday, right here in Mount Airy, a mom and her two daughters, young daughters, ages 11 and 4, were in the back bedroom of their mobile home. Some kids are passing by, and they knock on the window, and they say, "Your house is on fire." And sure enough, it was, and they barely made it out. And a lot of stuff was destroyed. In fact, all of their stuff was destroyed. They weren't able to take anything with them, but they did get out with their lives. And all of this ahead of the holiday season. And wouldn't you know it, the call came to Paul Foss and to Eric Kloss and a few people that are just known to represent God in our community. And so they did what they do, and they started pulling together resources and making phone calls. And last week at the 11 o'clock service, actually you guys, at this service, I think you remember passing the hat. $5,300 was collected on that impromptu pass the hat. So thank you all for that very, very much. But as you can imagine, for a family that's lost everything, that doesn't have any insurance, there's still a little more to do. So if you would consider, we're gonna pass the hat again and just see, can we do anything to really bring this thing home? If you can't give in a financial way, talk to Paul or to Eric Kloss, and they'll tell you what other ways you can help plug in and show this family some love. The Satries have been really big in this. The Satries have actually put them up in their in-law suite, and they've been living with them while the construction on their new place is happening. But this is really one of those opportunities where we can be the image of God. You know, when is God going to fix some of these messes? Well, you tell me. When's he going to fix some of these messes, right? It's on us. So watch this video. Our ushers are going to come forward. They're going to pass the plates while the video is going on. If you want to write a check, please make it payable to Water Boys for Jesus. And actually, as you watch this, there's something very cool here. So everyone can be activated and can be used, and the skills and talents that you have can help in the kingdom away. And sometimes that means swinging a hammer, and sometimes that means communicating a message. This video was put together by a guy in our community, Lee Emmons. Lee is here somewhere. I saw him earlier. But Lee has put this video together, and you want to talk about a way to effectively use your gifts and talents for the kingdom. We are grateful to have this guy on board with us. Okay, so we're going to run the video. We're going to pass the hat. Whatever you guys do, thank you so much. I'll come back out and pray after the video's done.
Last Monday, the mother and her kids were in their bedroom when they heard a rap on the window, and some kids from the community had come, saw that the porch here was on fire, and they ran to the window, knocked on the door and said, "Your house is on fire, your house is on fire."
So I say, "Hey, fire on the deck." And we opened the door and we saw all the fire and all the deck.
This family has 2 young daughters, ages 4 and 11. Of course, they were in the house when it was on fire, so very traumatic. Afterwards, they were looking around for their pet bunny, who they're very fond of, and nowhere to be found.
Apenas pude sacar a nosotros y algunas cosas que tenía a la mano, mi cartera. Entonces, cuando ya quise recordar del conejo y los pescados, ya era muy tarde porque el fuego ya estaba en la sala.
They're living paycheck to paycheck, and so they had no insurance on the trailer, and so they really lost everything. I remember my first thought was, well, it's a busy time of the year. I mean, Thanksgiving's coming up. A lot of people would be distracted. And within the next couple of hours, God really sort of pressed in and said, this is a project that is near and dear to my heart, and you'll deny me if you just don't step into this. And so on Monday, we had a company volunteer to send a dumpster and a crew, and they began the demolition on a new trailer that needs to be remodeled for the family to move in. The work has gone forward. There's crews of 12 to 15 men and women that come every day to work. So now we're in the process of being the miracle, and you can help us be that miracle as well. If you can help with any of the volunteer work, electrical, carpentry, plumbing, if there's any way you could financially help us, we can then use that to buy the materials that we need to do the remodeling project. So here we are, hands and feet, nails and saws, but we're really here because we've been so radically loved by Jesus, we just can't help ourselves.
All right, so thank you guys for being the hands and feet, for being the image of God in a world that really does need repaired and restored. Let's stand for prayer. Father, thank you so much for this morning. Thank you that we got to gather together as your community, as your temple, as your people. Lord, I pray that you would bless this group of folks as we go out into the world to be your hands and feet and to bear your image and to show your love and to look into the face of another and realize that that person was made in your image. Father, thank you for all of the ways that you've blessed us. Thank you so much for Christmas that's coming up. Help us to walk into that season with just great joy and great expectation. We love you, Lord. Amen.